Picture this: a field of crushed wheat and broken men. The afternoon sun beats down on bronze that no longer gleams. It's caked with dust and something darker. A sound rises from the earth itself, not screaming anymore, but a low, wet chorus of gurgling and gasping. Thousands of throats trying to pull air through blood, and beneath it all, another sound. The methodical crunch of footsteps, sandals pressing down on fingers, on faces, on the shattered remnants of shields that once made armies tremble. Each step is deliberate, each step closer. A man lies pinned beneath the body of someone who was his brother in arms. The corpse's weight presses the breath from his lungs in slow increments. He can feel warmth spreading across his thigh. His own blood or someone else's, he can no longer tell. The smell is overwhelming. Copper and excrement and the particular stench of opened bellies cooking in summer heat. His tongue is thick with dust. When he swallows, he tastes iron. The footsteps stop beside him. He looks up. Through the film of blood and sweat, he sees sandaled feet, then Greaves, then, impossibly, a hand reaching down. Not to kill, but to push aside the corpse pinning him. The face that comes into view wears no expression of triumph. Only a terrible, exhausted curiosity. This one's still alive, the voice says, speaking a dialect that marks him as Theban. This one wears the red cloak. The red cloak, the mark of Sparta. The garment that had made grown men surrender rather than face its wearers in battle. For 200 years, that crimson wool meant one thing: death is coming, and it wears your enemy's face. But today the red cloaks are scattered across the field like autumn leaves. Hundreds of them, perhaps 1,000, soaking through with fluids that turn their legendary scarlet into something darker, uglier, the brownish purple of meat left too long in the sun. The Spartan tries to speak. His jaw won't cooperate. Something is broken there, grinding when he attempts to move it. But his eyes still work, and through them, he watches the Theban soldier methodically strip a corpse 10 feet away. Greaves first, then breastplate, then the short sword that every Spartan carried closer than a lover. The Theban tests the blade's edge against his thumb, nods appreciatively. Good iron, he says to no one in particular. They always did make good iron. 40 minutes. That's all it took. 40 minutes to destroy what 2 centuries had built. 40 minutes to break the finest military machine the Greek world had ever produced. 40 minutes to prove that Sparta, invincible, terrifying, eternal Sparta, was made of the same meat and bone as everyone else. The man who orchestrated this slaughter stands 200 yards away, on a slight rise that overlooks the carnage. He is not celebrating. He is counting. His lips move silently as his eyes sweep the field, tallying the red cloaks, estimating the magnitude of what he has accomplished. His name is Epaminondas. He is 47 years old. He has never commanded an army in major battle before today. He is not wealthy, not nobly born, not blessed with powerful patrons or political connections. By every measure that Greeks use to judge a man's worth, he is nobody. And he has just killed Sparta. Not the city, that still stands far to the south, its temples and training grounds and iron discipline intact, but the idea of Sparta, the myth that had kept Greek cities obedient for generations, the terror that had prevented wars simply by existing, that died here, in a wheat field in Boeotia, on a summer afternoon in 371 BCE. Historians still debate whether Epaminondas fully understood what he had done in those first hours after the battle, whether he grasped that he had not merely won a military victory, but fundamentally altered the architecture of Greek power, whether he knew that the weapon he had unleashed, a simple geometric innovation, a mere rearrangement of men on a battlefield, would echo through military history for millennia, from Alexander to Napoleon to the armoured spearheads of the 20th century. But watching him stand there, lips moving, eyes counting the dead, one question burns brighter than all the others. How does a man with no army destroy the greatest warriors in the world? And what does it cost him to become the thing that Sparta feared? The dying started long before Leuctra. It started with a story Spartans told themselves until they believed it was scripture. 300 men at a narrow pass, a Persian army of impossible size, a last stand that bought Greece enough time to survive. Thermopylae, the word itself became a prayer, a promise, a poison. Every Spartan boy learned the story before he could properly hold a spear. How Leonidas chose his 300 knowing none would return. How they combed their hair and oiled their bodies before battle, preparing for death as other men prepared for weddings. How the Persians demanded they surrender their weapons, and Leonidas replied with 2 words that would echo through eternity: "Come take them." The story was perfect, too perfect, and perfection, when it becomes expectation, becomes a cage. By 371 BCE, Sparta had spent over a century living inside that cage. The Battle of Thermopylae wasn't just history. It was the standard against which every Spartan action was measured. Every campaign, every skirmish, every diplomatic negotiation carried the weight of those 300 ghosts. The Spartan military system, the agoge, had always been brutal. Boys taken from their mothers at 7, starved deliberately to teach them to steal food without getting caught, because a warrior who couldn't feed himself in enemy territory was useless, beaten for showing pain, encouraged to kill helots, the enslaved population that outnumbered Spartans 10 to 1, as training for killing enemies. But after Thermopylae, the brutality acquired a religious fervour. The purpose wasn't just to create effective soldiers anymore, it was to create men worthy of dying like Leonidas. Historians still debate whether this shift was conscious policy or gradual cultural drift, but the evidence of its effects is undeniable. By the 4th century, Spartan training had become less about winning wars and more about producing beautiful corpses. Consider the mathematics of their decline. At Thermopylae in 480 BCE, Sparta could field 8,000 full citizens, the Spartiates, the only true Spartans, the only ones who mattered. A century later, at Leuctra, that number had collapsed to somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000. Plague explained some of it, war casualties explained more, but the deeper cause was the system itself. To be a Spartiate, you needed land. Specifically, you needed enough land to pay your dues to the common mess, the Syssitia, where all Spartan men ate together in deliberately mediocre meals designed to prevent luxury. Lose your land, and you lost your citizenship. You became one of the Hypermions, the inferiors, still Spartan by blood but legally nothing. And land in Sparta increasingly concentrated in fewer hands. Wealthy Spartiates accumulated estates while poorer ones fell into the inferiors. Women could inherit property, and Spartan women, famously independent, famously fierce, held perhaps 40% of all Spartan land by the 4th century. But women couldn't fight in the phalanx. Their wealth didn't translate into spears on the battlefield. The result was a military aristocracy slowly eating itself. Each generation smaller than the last. Each red cloak more precious, more irreplaceable, more weighted with the expectation of glorious death. King Agesilaus, who ruled Sparta through most of this decline, reportedly wept when shown a list of fallen Spartiates after a minor battle. Not from grief, from accounting. Every name represented a hole in the phalanx that could not be filled. A slot that would remain empty until Sparta itself was empty. The solution should have been obvious. Expand citizenship. Train the perioikoi, the free non-citizens who surrounded Sparta, to fight as equals. Integrate the Hypermions back into the warrior class. Build the numbers that victory required. But that would have meant admitting that Spartan blood wasn't magical. That the agoge could be taught to anyone. That the legend of Thermopylae was the product of training and terrain, not divine favour. So they chose the myth over survival. They convinced themselves that quality would always defeat quantity. That one Spartiate was worth 10 ordinary soldiers. No, 20, 50, 100. That their ancestors had held the hot gates with 300 men, so surely they could hold Greece with 1,500. The smell of this delusion hung over Sparta like the smoke from their sacrificial fires. It saturated their red cloaks. It flavoured the black broth they ate with such theatrical distaste. It whispered to every young man who completed the agoge, "You are special, you are chosen, you were born to die beautifully." And somewhere in Thebes, a middle-aged philosopher with a gift for geometry was taking notes. Epaminondas should not have existed. Everything about his life contradicted what Greeks expected from their generals. He was poor in a society that measured worth in land and slaves. He was philosophical in a culture that suspected intellectuals of cowardice. He was celibate, or nearly so, in a world that judged men by the sons they produced. His father, Polymnis, had been respectable but not wealthy. Respectable enough to hire tutors for his son. Not wealthy enough to leave him an inheritance that mattered. When Polymnis died, Epaminondas found himself in the peculiar position of being educated beyond his station. A man who could quote Pythagoras but couldn't afford a decent suit of armour. For most Greeks, this would have meant a life of quiet obscurity. Teaching, perhaps, or attaching himself to a richer man as a kind of intellectual servant. The ancient world had little patience for talent without resources. But Thebes was not most Greek cities. Thebes sat at the heart of Boeotia, a region that Athenians mocked as backward and Spartans barely acknowledged. Boeotian pig was an Athenian insult. The implication was rural stupidity, peasant dullness, a people too slow to appreciate the finer things. The Thebans internalized this contempt and transmuted it into something dangerous, a chip on their collective shoulder the size of Mount Helicon. They knew they weren't as cultured as Athens. They knew they weren't as feared as Sparta. This knowledge sat in their throats like a bone that wouldn't go down. Into this atmosphere of resentment, Epaminondas brought something new. Not just anger at Theban humiliation, but a systematic analysis of how that humiliation had been achieved. He studied Sparta obsessively, not with hatred, that would come later, but with the cold fascination of a physician examining a disease. He read every account of Spartan battles he could find. He interviewed mercenaries who had fought alongside and against the Red Cloaks. He reconstructed their formations with pebbles on his dirt floor, moving them through engagements that had happened before he was born. What he discovered changed everything. Spartan invincibility, he realized, was built on a single architectural principle. The phalanx drifted right during combat. Every phalanx, not just Sparta's. When men carried shields on their left arms and spears in their right hands, they naturally edged toward their unshielded side, seeking the protection of the man beside them. This drift was universal, unavoidable, almost gravitational. The Spartans hadn't invented this drift, but they had mastered its exploitation. By placing their best troops on the right wing, the position of honor in Greek warfare, they ensured that their elite fighters would strike the enemy's weakest point, the left wing, where lesser troops naturally congregated. The Spartan right would shatter the enemy left, then wheel inward to roll up the entire opposing line. It had worked for 200 years. It was elegant. It was reliable. It was, Epaminondas realized with growing excitement, completely predictable. Historians still debate whether Epaminondas' insight was purely intellectual or born from personal humiliation. We know he fought at the Battle of Leuctra's predecessor, Tegeira, in 375 BCE, a minor engagement where a small Theban force somehow defeated a larger Spartan unit. Some scholars believe this impossible victory planted the seed. Others point to the influence of Pythagorean philosophy, with its obsession with mathematical harmony and geometric proportion. Whatever the source, the solution he developed was breathtakingly simple. Stop playing by Spartan rules. Instead of matching strength against strength, right wing against right wing, Epaminondas would invert the entire equation. He would stack his left wing impossibly deep, 50 shields where normal formations used 8 or 12, and refuse his right wing entirely. Let the Spartans win where it didn't matter. He would annihilate them where it did. The idea sat in his mind for years, unspoken. Thebes wasn't at war with Sparta. The Peace of Antalcidas, brokered by Persia in 387 BCE, had frozen Greek politics into an uneasy equilibrium. Speaking openly of new tactics for fighting Spartans would be diplomatically disastrous and personally dangerous. So Epaminondas waited. He taught philosophy to young men. He cultivated friendships with Theban aristocrats who found his poverty charming rather than disqualifying. He watched the political winds and said nothing about the geometric trap coiling in his imagination. The trap needed only one thing to spring it: a Spartan king arrogant enough to walk into the killing ground without seeing it. 14 years of patience, 14 years of silence. Then came Cleombrotus. The weapon that broke Sparta wasn't just geometry, it was love. 300 men, 150 pairs, each pair bound not by military oath but by something Greeks considered simultaneously sacred and shameful: erotic attachment between warriors. The sacred band of Thebes. The idea came from Gorgidas, a Theban general who understood something that more conventional commanders missed. Men fight well for their cities. They fight better for their comrades. But they fight with suicidal fury when the man beside them is the person they love, and when retreat means watching that person die, or worse, witnessing their beloved see them display cowardice. The formation of the sacred band in 378 BCE formalized what had existed informally throughout Greek military culture. The Erastes-Eromenos relationship, the older lover and younger beloved, was embedded in aristocratic Greek education. Sparta itself institutionalized such bonds in the Agoge, but only Thebes made it the explicit foundation of an elite military unit. The selection process was rigorous beyond anything Sparta demanded. Physical beauty mattered. Greeks were Greeks, but it was secondary to proven courage and demonstrated devotion. Each pair was evaluated not just for individual merit, but for the intensity of their bond. The theory was simple. A man might flee to save his own life, but he would die before shaming himself in his beloved's eyes. Gorgidas initially scattered the sacred band throughout the Theban line, using them as stiffening for ordinary troops, but Pelopidas, Epaminondas' closest friend, a wealthy aristocrat who had financed much of Theban resistance to Sparta, recognized their true potential. Under his command, the sacred band became a concentrated strike force. 300 men who moved as one organism, fought as one organism, died as one organism. The psychological architecture was devastating. Each warrior knew that his partner was watching every movement, judging every decision. Cowardice was unthinkable, not because of military discipline, but because shame before a lover cut deeper than any sword. And the bonds created redundancy that ordinary units lacked. When one man fell, his partner didn't collapse into grief. He erupted into rage. Historians still debate whether the sacred band's reputation was earned or exaggerated. Skeptics point out that elite units always acquire legends that exceed reality. But the evidence of Tegeira speaks for itself. In 375 BCE, Pelopidas led the sacred band against a Spartan force twice their size, and won. 2 Spartan polemarchs died in the fighting. The red cloaks retreated. The news travelled across Greece like a fever. Spartans had lost before to the Athenians at Sphacteria, where conditions had been exceptional, where the defeated were more captured than beaten. But Tegeira was different. This was open battle. This was Spartan spears against Theban spears, Spartan discipline against Theban fury, and the fury had won. The taste of that victory changed something in Thebes. For generations, Thebans had accepted Spartan dominance as natural, like accepting that the sun rose in the east. Hegemony wasn't just political arrangement, it was the shape of the universe. You didn't question it any more than you questioned gravity. Tegeira proved that gravity could be defied. In the years that followed, Pelopidas and Epaminondas became inseparable, an unlikely pairing, the wealthy warrior and the penniless philosopher, the man of action and the man of thought. But their complementary strengths created something neither possessed alone. Pelopidas understood men, Epaminondas understood systems. Together they began reshaping Thebes into a weapon aimed directly at Sparta's heart. The smell of the gymnasium where the sacred band trained became the smell of revolution. Sweat and olive oil and the particular metallic tang of men pushing themselves past exhaustion. Young Thebans who had grown up hearing their fathers' defeats now watched 300 warriors perform maneuvers that seemed impossible. Moving in perfect synchronization, shields interlocking like the scales of some great bronze serpent, spears rising and falling with mechanical precision. But beneath the discipline, something darker pulsed. The bonds that made the sacred band formidable also made them volatile. Love, unlike military loyalty, doesn't follow orders. Jealousy flared, rivalries developed between pairs. The intensity that drove men to superhuman courage in battle sometimes drove them to destructive passion in peacetime. Pelopidas managed these tensions through sheer force of personality. He was beloved himself by the entire band, if not by any individual member of it. His presence smoothed conflicts, channeled aggression, kept the weapon pointed outward. But weapons have a way of demanding use, and by 371 BCE, the sacred band had been sharpened for 6 years without a worthy target. They were ready to kill something that mattered, and Sparta was about to provide the opportunity. The Congress at Sparta in 371 BCE was supposed to prevent war. It accomplished the opposite. Delegations from across Greece gathered in the city that had dominated their world for generations. Athenians came, still bitter from their defeat in the Peloponnesian War, but pragmatic enough to seek accommodation. Smaller city-states sent representatives hoping to preserve whatever autonomy Spartan hegemony permitted, and from Thebes came Epaminondas, representing a city that had been humiliated, occupied, and libelled for decades. The Persians had brokered this peace, as they brokered everything in 4th century Greece. The great king found it useful to keep the Greeks divided, exhausted, incapable of threatening his empire again. The formula was simple: every city-state would be autonomous. No hegemon would dominate. Sparta would guarantee the peace, which meant Sparta would enforce its will while calling it neutrality. The first days of negotiation proceeded with elaborate courtesy. Wine was poured, sacrifices were offered, diplomats spoke in careful circumlocutions, saying nothing while appearing to say everything. The hot Laconian sun pressed down on the proceedings like a physical weight, and servants circulated with fans that moved the air without cooling it. Then came the day Epaminondas destroyed everything. The issue was technical but explosive. Who would sign the peace treaty on behalf of Boeotia? The other Greek states signed individually. Athens signed for Athens, Corinth signed for Corinth. But Thebes claimed leadership of the Boeotian League, a confederation of cities that Sparta had spent years trying to dissolve. Epaminondas insisted on signing for all of Boeotia. King Agesilaus, presiding over the Congress with barely concealed contempt, demanded Thebes sign only for itself. The argument that followed became legendary. According to ancient accounts, Epaminondas asked Agesilaus whether Sparta would grant independence to the Perioikoi, the non-citizen Spartans who laboured to support the Spartiate elite. Agesilaus, caught off guard, refused. Epaminondas pressed further. Would Sparta free Messenia, the entire region it had enslaved for 3 centuries? Would Sparta dissolve its own league while demanding Thebes dissolve hers? The hypocrisy was naked. The entire Congress could see it. But Agesilaus had power, and Epaminondas had only words, and in Greece power had always won that contest. Agesilaus struck Thebes from the treaty. Literally. He took a stylus and scratched the Theban name from the document. The peace would proceed without them. Thebes would stand alone against whatever Sparta chose to do next. Historians still debate whether Epaminondas planned this outcome. Some argue he genuinely sought peace and was outmaneuvered by Agesilaus's brutality. Others suggest he deliberately provoked the confrontation, knowing that only war could break Spartan hegemony permanently. The evidence supports the darker interpretation. Thebes had spent years preparing for exactly this moment. The sacred band was trained and eager. The Boeotian League provided manpower and resources. Most critically, Epaminondas had developed his tactical innovation, the deep formation, the refused wing, the geometric trap, and needed only the opportunity to deploy it. By forcing Sparta to choose between accepting Boeotian unity and starting a war, Epaminondas had created a situation where his enemy must either surrender the principle of hegemony or fight on Theban terms. Agesilaus chose war. The old king was 70 years old, his body twisted by a lifetime of campaigning, one leg shorter than the other from an ancient wound. He could not lead the army himself. That task fell to his co-king Cleombrotus, a man who had spent his career in Agesilaus's shadow, burning for an opportunity to prove himself. Cleombrotus received his orders within days of the Congress's end: march into Boeotia, crush Thebes, restore the natural order of Greek politics. The Spartan army assembled at the border, perhaps 11,000 men, including 700 Spartiates, the largest concentration of elite Spartan warriors in a generation. Enough force, conventional wisdom held, to destroy any army Greece could produce. The irony was exquisite. Sparta was sending its most precious resource, its irreplaceable citizen warriors, into a battle designed by an enemy who understood exactly how to make that resource worthless. When the army marched, the red cloaks rippling in the summer wind, the Spartans sang hymns to Apollo, war songs passed down through generations, music that had accompanied them to victories beyond counting. They did not know they were singing their own funeral dirge. And in Thebes, Epaminondas heard reports of their approach and began positioning his pieces for the trap that would swallow them whole. Cleombrotus moved fast. Too fast. The conventional route into Boeotia ran through the mountain passes that Theban forces had fortified for exactly this scenario. Cleombrotus avoided it. His scouts found an alternative path, coastal, unexpected, undefended. Within days, the Spartan army had bypassed the prepared defences and stood on Boeotian soil. The Thebans scrambled to respond. Their defensive strategy assumed Sparta would do what Sparta always did: advance directly, rely on superior training, grind through opposition by sheer professional excellence. Cleombrotus's flanking manoeuvre violated these assumptions. It suggested either tactical genius or dangerous recklessness. Epaminondas suspected the latter. The Spartan king established camp near Leuctra, a minor town of no particular significance. The ground was acceptable, relatively flat, with a slight ridge that offered marginal advantage to whoever held it. Nothing about the terrain favoured either army decisively. It was simply where the two forces found themselves when movement stopped and fighting became inevitable. For 3 days, the armies watched each other across the plain. Skirmishers clashed, cavalry probed, but the main forces held position, each waiting for conditions to favour attack. Inside the Theban camp, a debate raged. The Boeotarchs, the elected generals who theoretically commanded Theban forces, were evenly split on whether to fight. 3 advocated retreat. The Spartan army was larger, its reputation was terrifying. Discretion demanded they avoid pitched battle and wage a defensive campaign, forcing Sparta to exhaust itself against fortified positions. 3 others, led by Epaminondas, argued for immediate engagement. The vote was deadlocked until Pelopidas arrived with the sacred band. As commander of the elite unit, he held technical authority that transcended the Boeotarch council. He cast his support behind Epaminondas. The decision was made. They would fight. But the arguments against battle weren't foolish. The numerical disadvantage was real. Sparta fielded 11,000 soldiers. Thebes could muster perhaps 7,000. More critically, the Spartans brought 700 Spartiates, men who had spent their entire lives preparing for exactly this kind of engagement. Thebes had nothing comparable except the sacred band, and 300 men couldn't offset a deficit of 4,000. Epaminondas spent the night before battle walking among his troops. He offered no inspiring speeches, no promises of glory. Instead, he asked questions. Where are you from? Do you have children? What do you hope for when this ends? The soldiers found it strange. Generals didn't talk to common infantry. They issued orders. They inspired through distance, not intimacy. But Epaminondas understood something about the men he was about to sacrifice. They needed to believe their commander saw them as human beings, not spear points in a formation. They needed to know that someone would remember their names. Historians still debate whether this behaviour was calculated manipulation or genuine compassion. Perhaps both. Epaminondas was philosopher enough to recognise that sincere feeling and tactical usefulness need not contradict. Dawn on July 6th, 371 BCE brought heat that promised to be brutal. The sun rose red through dust that hadn't settled from 2 armies' movement. Soldiers woke to the smell of cooking fires and latrines, the mundane odours of military encampment that would soon be overwhelmed by blood. The Theban camp was deliberately chaotic. Epaminondas had ordered non-combatants, servants, merchants, camp followers, to intermingle with soldiers as they formed up. From the Spartan lines, the Theban deployment looked confused, almost shambolic. Officers struggled to organise their units, men milled about without apparent purpose. It was theatre. Every moment of confusion bought time for Epaminondas' real formation to take shape behind the screen of bodies. On the Spartan side, Cleombrotus arranged his forces in the traditional manner. The 700 Spartiates, accompanied by their support troops, formed the right wing, the position of honour, the position of death. Allies from the Peloponnese filled the centre and left. 12 shields deep across the entire line. Professional, disciplined, exactly as generations of Spartan commanders had deployed before. Cleombrotus had no reason to innovate. Innovation implied uncertainty, and Spartans were never uncertain. They knew how battles worked. They had proven it countless times. The Thebans would form up, the lines would clash, the superior Spartan right would shatter the inferior Theban left, and the day would end as such days always ended. The king watched the apparent disorder in the Theban camp and felt something approaching contempt. These amateurs couldn't even form a proper line. This would be easy. This would be a demonstration of everything that made Sparta great. He gave the order to advance. Across the field, behind the screen of confusion, Epaminondas smiled. The trap was ready. The Spartans were walking into it, and nothing in their 2 centuries of victory had prepared them for what was about to happen. The Spartan centre and left never engaged. This fact, more than any other, haunted Greek military thinkers for generations. 11,000 soldiers stood watching while their elite wing was methodically destroyed. 4,000 allied troops, Phocians, Phliasians, men from across the Peloponnese, held formation facing an enemy that refused to meet them. The Theban refused wing had done its work perfectly. By echeloning backward, Epaminondas ensured that his weaker forces would never fight at all. The allies facing them couldn't advance without exposing their flank to the rampaging Theban left. They couldn't retreat without abandoning their Spartiate comrades to certain doom. They could only stand and watch. The psychology of those minutes must have been excruciating. From the allied position, the sounds of slaughter carried clearly. Screams, the grinding of bronze on bronze, the particular wet sounds of bodies being opened. The dust cloud over the Spartiate wing grew darker as it absorbed blood, and still they stood. Still they waited for orders that never came. Cleombrotus was dead. His sub-commanders were dying. The Spartan chain of command, built around individual officers of legendary competence, couldn't function when those officers were being killed faster than replacements could step forward. On the Theban side, Epaminondas maintained brutal discipline. His reserves didn't charge forward to join the slaughter. That would have dissipated the concentrated force that was winning the battle. Instead, fresh troops rotated through the 50-deep column, replacing exhausted warriors at the front with rested killers from the rear. The Spartiates who survived the initial collision found themselves fighting an enemy that never tired. The smell of the battle changed as morning stretched toward noon. Early violence smelled of blood and fear, copper and hormones, and the sharp tang of adrenaline sweat. But as bodies accumulated and the sun climbed higher, a different odour emerged. The sweetish, nauseating scent of decay beginning even before the fighting ended. Opened intestines releasing their contents. Exposed organs cooking in armour that had become ovens. Historians still debate whether the Spartan allied commanders could have intervened. Some argue they were paralysed by protocol. Without orders from the king, they lacked authority to act. Others suggest they recognised the battle was already lost and saw no point in adding their casualties to a defeat that couldn't be prevented. The darker interpretation, they simply didn't care. The Spartiate elite had never treated allies as equals. Peloponnesian cities had been exploited, humiliated, forced to provide manpower for wars that served only Spartan interests. Why die to save masters who had never shown gratitude? Whatever the reason, the centre and left held their positions while the Spartan right wing ceased to exist. The fighting devolved from organised combat into hunts. Surviving Spartiates, separated from their units, attempted to cut their way free. Most failed. The sacred band, its initial formation broken by the chaos of victory, reformed into smaller groups that systematically ran down red cloaks. Pelopidas, according to accounts that may be exaggerated, personally killed 3 Spartiates in the pursuit. His cloak was soaked through with blood, his own from a wound to his thigh, his enemies from everywhere else. He limped but didn't stop. None of the sacred band stopped. The physics of ancient battle favoured pursuers. Men in flight dropped shields to run faster. Men without shields died when caught. The plain of Leuctra became a killing floor where Spartan training meant nothing because Spartan formation had already been destroyed. The temperature on the field, in the press of bodies and violence, exceeded anything the morning sun could explain. Men collapsed from heat exhaustion between blows. Water-bearers who ventured onto the field to serve the Theban troops were themselves attacked by Spartans desperate enough to kill for a drink. At some point, the sources disagree on exactly when, the remaining Spartan forces broke completely. Retreat ceased to be organised withdrawal and became simple flight. Allied contingents that had held their ground through the slaughter of the Spartiates found their own resolve evaporating. The rout became general. By noon, the Battle of Leuctra was over. 400 Spartiates lay dead on the field, more than half of those who had marched into Boeotia. Among them, King Cleombrotus, 2 polemarchs, perhaps a dozen other officers whose loss could never be replaced. The remaining Spartan forces retreated to their fortified camp, too shocked to count their losses, too broken to risk another engagement, and on the Theban side, fewer than 300 dead total. The mathematics of what had happened would take days to fully comprehend. Generations of Spartan military supremacy erased in 40 minutes, the invincible phalanx shattered by a geometric trick, and 300 lovers who refused to shame themselves before each other. The day Sparta died had lasted less than an hour. The Spartan camp that night was silent in ways that disturbed the survivors. Spartans were trained to mourn. Their rituals for the fallen were ancient, elaborate, designed to transform grief into pride. When a warrior died in battle, his family was supposed to celebrate. He had achieved the only end worth achieving. Mothers were expected to be gladder for sons who fell than for those who returned. But the rituals required context. They required proportionality. They required the dead to be heroes who had taken more than they gave. Leuctra offered none of this. 400 Spartiates. The number echoed through the camp like a curse. 400 men who could never be replaced, whose bloodlines ended in a wheat field in Boeotia, whose red cloaks were now being stripped by Theban servants looking for salvageable bronze. The survivors tried to perform the proper ceremonies. They gathered what bodies they could recover, not all, not nearly all, and prepared them according to tradition. Oil and cloth, proper positioning, the words that had been spoken over Spartan dead since the age of legends. But the words caught in throats. The rituals felt hollow. How did you celebrate a disaster? Historians still debate whether the Spartans truly grasped their situation that first night. Some argue they expected reinforcement, rescue, a second chance. Others suggest the magnitude of defeat was so incomprehensible that the mind simply refused to process it. The truth may be simpler. They were in shock, professional soldiers all, veterans of campaigns beyond counting, and they had never experienced anything like this. Their bodies went through motions their minds couldn't direct. Cleombrotus's body, recovered at terrible cost, lay in the command tent. Wounds cleaned, armour removed, looking peaceful in a way the living found obscene. He had wanted glory. He had wanted to step out from Agesilaus' shadow. Instead, he had led Sparta's finest into a trap designed by a philosopher who had never before commanded an army. The irony tasted like copper. Across the plain, the Theban camp erupted in celebration that could be heard for miles. Singing and shouting and the particular sound of men who had survived what they thought would kill them. Wine flowed, supplies captured from Spartan baggage trains added to Theban stores. The sacred band's surviving pairs embraced openly, their bonds affirmed by blood that had been shared rather than separated. Epaminondas did not celebrate. He walked the battlefield in the gathering darkness, a torchbearer beside him, surveying what he had accomplished. The bodies of the fallen lay where they had dropped. Theban and Spartan intermingled, death erasing the distinctions that life had insisted upon. The smell was already changing, the first hints of decay underlying the blood and excrement. He stopped at a corpse wearing the red cloak, a man perhaps his own age, face relaxed into an expression that might have been surprise or might have been peace. The Spartan's shield lay nearby, its blazon identifying him as a full Spartiate, not a lesser Lacedaemonian. According to accounts that may be apocryphal, Epaminondas knelt beside the body and said something the torchbearer couldn't quite hear. Perhaps a prayer, perhaps an apology, perhaps simply a soldier's acknowledgement of another soldier's death. Then he rose and continued walking. The full cost of Leuctra would take years to calculate, not just the 400 Spartiates, though that alone was crippling, perhaps a third of Sparta's remaining citizen warriors, but the psychological damage, the shattering of a myth that had kept Greek cities obedient for generations. Other Greeks had feared Sparta because Spartans seemed inhuman, perfect killing machines produced by a society that existed only to produce perfect killing machines. Defeating them in battle was theoretically possible, but psychologically unthinkable. Why fight what couldn't be beaten? Leuctra proved Spartans could be beaten, proved it dramatically, conclusively, in a way that could never be unproven. Every city that had submitted to Spartan dominance would now ask, why did we surrender to men who can die like anyone else? The news spread across Greece with the speed of scandal. Within days, messengers had carried word to Athens, to Corinth, to the islands, to the colonies. Within weeks, the entire Greek world knew that something fundamental had changed. Sparta was not destroyed. The city still stood. Thousands of soldiers still bore its arms. The tradition still shaped daily life. But the thing that had made Sparta powerful, the belief in its invincibility, was dead. And the man who killed it was already planning what came next. Epaminondas looked south, toward the Peloponnese, toward the territories Sparta had dominated for centuries, toward Messenia, where hundreds of thousands of helots laboured in slavery. The weapon he had forged at Leuctra was not just tactical, it was moral, it was political, it was the instrument that would dismantle Sparta's entire empire. The battle was over, the revolution had just begun. The Spartans who returned home found a city that didn't know how to receive them. Tradition demanded that families of the fallen celebrate. The red cloaks who died at Leuctra had achieved the only glory worth achieving, death in battle, facing the enemy, upholding the honour that made Spartans Spartans. Their mothers should weep with joy, their fathers should walk proud. But what about the survivors? In Spartan law, soldiers who retreated from battle were trazants, tremblers, cowards whose shame contaminated everyone they touched. They lost citizenship rights. Their families refused to acknowledge them. Other Spartans were permitted, even encouraged, to strike them in the street without consequence. The problem was scale. At Leuctra, the entire right wing had collapsed. The entire allied army had retreated. Hundreds of Spartiates had survived who, by strict interpretation of the law, should now be treated as subhuman. The city faced an impossible choice: enforce tradition and destroy what remained of the citizen army, or bend tradition and undermine the ideology that made Sparta unique. King Agesilaus, too old and crippled to have fought at Leuctra himself, resolved the crisis with a phrase that became infamous. He declared that the laws would sleep for a day, the survivors would be pardoned, the shame would be deferred. Historians still debate whether this compromise saved Sparta or accelerated its decline. The pardon preserved military manpower at a moment when every spear counted, but it established a precedent that the laws weren't absolute, that even Spartan custom could bend when bending was convenient. The smell of hypocrisy hung over the city like smoke from the offering fires. In the months following Leuctra, Sparta attempted to behave as though nothing fundamental had changed. Diplomatic missions went out to allies demanding continued loyalty. Military preparations continued as though the next campaign would reverse the last. The training ground still echoed with the sounds of boys becoming warriors. But the numbers told a different story. Before Leuctra, Sparta could claim perhaps 1,500 Spartiates. After Leuctra, the figure was closer to 1,000, and falling. Every season brought deaths from age, from disease, from the accumulated violence of campaigns that had drained citizen blood for generations. Every season, the pool of replacement warriors failed to meet demand. The Agog still produced soldiers, but producing soldiers wasn't the problem. Producing Spartiates, full citizens with land, with the wealth to maintain their mess dues, with the hereditary claims that made Spartan identity valid, was impossible without systemic reform that the system existed to prevent. Sparta was dying of its own exclusivity. Meanwhile, word of Leuctra's tactics spread across Greece. Military theorists analysed Epaminondas' formation, debated its applications, wondered if the oblique order could work in other circumstances. The secret weapon was secret no longer. It had been demonstrated in the most public arena imaginable. Other cities began training deep formations. Other commanders experimented with refused wings. The competitive advantage that Epaminondas had invented was already being copied by men who would eventually use it against Thebes itself. But for now, the advantage belonged to Thebes. Epaminondas spent the winter after Leuctra consolidating his position. The victory had elevated him from obscure philosopher to supreme general almost overnight. Theban politics, previously divided between factions that balanced each other, now crystallized around his leadership. His allies became the only allies that mattered. The transformation wasn't entirely welcome. Epaminondas had survived his poverty through deliberate obscurity. Power attracts enemies, and he had avoided making any. Now obscurity was impossible. Every faction he didn't support became a faction that opposed him. Pelopidas remained loyal. The Sacred Band's commander had risked everything on Epaminondas' tactical genius, and been vindicated beyond his wildest projections. Their friendship deepened into something approaching co-rule, though neither held formal titles that acknowledged this. But friends were finite, enemies multiplied. In Sparta, Agesilaus channeled his humiliation into planning. The old king understood that Leuctra couldn't be avenged through conventional means. The manpower simply didn't exist. But Thebes' ambition was already creating resentments. Former allies, forced to choose between Spartan hegemony and Theban hegemony, might choose Sparta as the lesser evil. The geopolitical chessboard was rearranging itself, and both sides knew that Leuctra was just the opening move. What came next would determine whether Sparta's wound was fatal or merely crippling. Spring would bring an answer, and it would bring Epaminondas south, into the heartland of Spartan power, with a weapon more devastating than any phalanx formation, an idea. The idea that slaves could become free. Epaminondas crossed into the Peloponnese in winter, when Sparta least expected invasion. Traditionally, Greek armies campaigned in summer. Winter meant mud, cold, supply difficulties that could destroy a force more surely than enemy spears. But Epaminondas understood that tradition was another word for predictability, and predictability had killed Spartans at Leuctra. He brought 40,000 men, the largest Greek army since Xerxes invaded, and this one wasn't Persian. This one was Theban, Arcadian, Argive, Elean. Every city-state that had chafed under Spartan dominance contributed what it could. The army that marched south was less a military force than a coalition of grudges given bronze and purpose. The objective was not Sparta itself. Epaminondas knew that sieging the unwalled city would accomplish nothing except creating martyrs. Instead, he aimed at the foundation of Spartan power, Messenia. For over 3 centuries, Sparta had enslaved the Messenian population. The Helots, hundreds of thousands of them, worked Messenian land, produced Messenian food, generated the surplus that allowed Spartans to be warriors instead of farmers. Without Messenia, Sparta was just another minor polis. With Messenia, Sparta had been an empire. Epaminondas marched to break that equation permanently. The liberation of Messenia unfolded over months of careful construction. A new city rose on Mount Ithome, Messene, named for the region's ancient identity before Sparta erased it. Walls 60 feet thick, designed by engineers who understood that Sparta would spend generations trying to reconquer what it had lost. A population drawn from Helots, who suddenly found themselves citizens of their own nation. Historians still debate whether Epaminondas was motivated by humanitarianism or strategy. The Helot system was monstrous. Greeks who visited Sparta were often disturbed by its brutality. Every year, Spartan youth declared ritual war on the Helots and murdered those who seemed dangerous, creating a culture of terror designed to prevent rebellion. Ending this system had genuine moral weight, but it also destroyed Sparta as a great power. Without Messenian surplus, Spartiate numbers would continue collapsing. Without the threat of Helot rebellion, Sparta couldn't justify its perpetual military posture. The liberation was both righteous and ruthless, a humanitarian achievement that happened to annihilate an enemy. The taste of freedom, after 3 centuries of slavery, must have been overwhelming. Messenians who had lived their entire lives expecting to die as property suddenly had walls to defend, citizens to become, futures that didn't depend on Spartan mercy. The first generation of free Messenians worked with a fury that astounded observers. They were building the world their grandchildren would inherit, but freedom created complications. The coalition that liberated Messenia wanted different things. Arcadians sought regional dominance. Argives nursed ancient grudges against Sparta that predated Messenian slavery. Thebes needed allies but couldn't afford to let allies become rivals. Every partner in the liberation was also a potential threat. Epaminondas managed these contradictions through sheer force of personality. His reputation after Leuctra was so overwhelming that disagreements resolved themselves when he expressed preferences, but personality isn't policy. Eventually he would be gone, and the alliances he'd built would discover they had nothing in common except hatred of Sparta. The return from Messenia was triumph. Theban streets filled with citizens celebrating the man who had broken Sparta's spine. Poets composed verses, artists planned monuments. Epaminondas was no longer a general, he was a legend, a figure whose name would echo through history. He responded to this adulation with characteristic austerity. He declined honours, he refused wealth. He continued living in the modest house his father had left him, wearing the same threadbare cloak he'd worn before Leuctra. This refusal of luxury disturbed Theban elites more than they admitted. Power was supposed to manifest in visible ways: estates, slaves, fine clothing. A leader who rejected these trappings implied that others were wrong to embrace them. Epaminondas' poverty became a silent judgment on everyone who wasn't poor. Political opposition began coalescing. Not openly, no one could criticize the liberator of Messenia directly, but quietly, in private gatherings, in conversations that stopped when certain people entered rooms. Epaminondas knew he was making enemies. The knowledge didn't change his behavior. He had been forged by poverty and philosophy into something that couldn't bend toward accommodation. His integrity was genuine, but genuine integrity is often indistinguishable from arrogance. The Thebans who had celebrated him began to wonder, was this man serving Thebes, or was he using Thebes to serve his vision? The distinction would matter. Eventually it would matter enormously, but for now the victories continued. Sparta's allies peeled away. Sparta's territory shrank. The hegemony that had dominated Greece for generations was collapsing month by month. Epaminondas had won. The problem with winning was discovering what came next. And what came next was another war, another battle, another demonstration of the tactical genius that had shattered Sparta. Only this time, the geometry that created victory would also create the grave. 9 years after Leuctra, Epaminondas returned to battle with the same tactics that had made him legend. The enemy was Sparta again. Sparta and its remaining allies gathered for one final attempt to reverse their decline. The battlefield was Mantinea, in the central Peloponnese, ground that had witnessed Greek blood before and would witness it again. Epaminondas deployed the oblique order. The deep column, the refused wing, the concentrated mass striking at a single point while the rest of the line held back. It had worked at Leuctra. It had worked in the campaigns since. There was no reason to believe it wouldn't work again. And it did work. The Theban left shattered the enemy right exactly as physics demanded. The sacred band drove through opposition with the same fury that had broken Spartan Spartiate on that summer afternoon years before. The battle followed the pattern Epaminondas had established. Mass overwhelming resistance, geometry defeating tradition. But battles are chaos, and in chaos the extraordinary becomes possible. The sources disagree on exactly what happened. Some say Epaminondas was leading the charge personally, as he always did, when a Spartan spear found him. Others suggest an Athenian named Grillus struck the killing blow. Athens had allied with Sparta against Thebes, one of the strange reversals that Greek politics regularly produced. What everyone agrees on, Epaminondas took a spear through the chest. The weapon punched through his breastplate at a joint, entering between ribs, lodging somewhere in the organs that kept men alive. His guards carried him from the fighting. The battle continued. Battles don't pause for individual deaths, even deaths that change everything. The Theban victory proceeded to its conclusion. The enemy routed. The field belonged to Thebes, but the field's conqueror was dying. Epaminondas lay in a tent as physicians examined a wound they couldn't treat. The spear remained lodged in his chest. Removing it would cause immediate death, but leaving it meant slow death. Minutes, perhaps. An hour if luck held. According to multiple ancient sources, Epaminondas asked about the battle's outcome. When told Thebes had won, he asked about his generals, Diophantus and Eulidas, the men he had trained as successors. When told they had died in the fighting, he's supposed to have said, "Then it is time to make peace." Historians still debate whether these words are authentic or legendary Polish. They sound too perfect, too epigrammatic, too precisely what a philosopher general should say at the moment of death. But authentic or not, they captured truth. With Epaminondas and his chosen successors dead, Theban hegemony had no one to lead it. The tactical genius couldn't be inherited. The strategic vision couldn't be transmitted. Everything Epaminondas had built was stored in a mind that was bleeding out in a tent in the Peloponnese. He ordered the spear pulled free. Death came quickly after. The man who killed Spartan invincibility died at 62. He had never married. He had no children. He left no estate, no political dynasty, no written record of his tactical innovations. Everything he was vanished with his final breath. Thebes won the Battle of Mantinea, but the victory meant nothing. Without leadership, the coalition Epaminondas had assembled disintegrated. Allies who had marched together drifted apart. The Arcadians returned to Arcadia. The Argives nursed their own ambitions. Messenia remained free. That achievement at least outlasted its architect. But Theban dominance over Greece ended the same day its creator died. The weapon that annihilated the Spartan phalanx also annihilated its inventor. The oblique order would endure. Philip of Macedon studied it, refined it, incorporated it into the military system that would eventually conquer Greece. His son Alexander used it to destroy the Persian Empire. 2,000 years later, Frederick the Great of Prussia would deploy the same geometric principle against enemies who had forgotten where it came from. Epaminondas' innovation outlived Epaminondas. It outlived Thebes. It outlived the entire Greek world. But the man himself was buried in a plain tomb, with honours that lasted a generation before being forgotten. Thebes eventually fell to Macedon. Alexander destroyed the city utterly in 335 BCE, enslaving its population, razing its walls, erasing its presence from the physical landscape. The sacred band died at Chæronea in 338 BCE, fighting Alexander's father Philip. 300 men, 150 pairs, falling where they stood rather than retreat. Their grave mound still exists, a quiet reminder of what love and training could accomplish. Sparta endured, diminished, humiliated, no longer great but present. The city that Epaminondas broke outlasted the city that broke it. There is no justice in survival, only persistence. The helots Epaminondas freed built their nation into something lasting. Messenia remained independent for centuries after Thebes was dust and memory. Perhaps that's the legacy worth remembering. Not the tactics, not the victories, but the hundreds of thousands of human beings who lived free because a philosopher learned geometry. Epaminondas died at Mantinea using the weapon he'd forged at Leuctra. The empire he built died with him. The idea he created, that concentration defeats distribution, that systems have blind spots, that the invincible are only invincible until someone stops believing, that idea never died at all. History remembers the victory, it forgot the price. The man who killed Sparta didn't survive to see what he'd made. Perhaps that's what victory costs. Everything, including the right to enjoy it.